I had I guess a reading or a teaching. I actually don't know the distinction, from Upadesa Saram, 14th verse. Lasting control of the mind can be accomplished by stilling it through breath control, then contemplating that. I'll say it again. Lasting control of the mind can be accomplished by stilling it through breath control, then contemplating that.
Is that the entire verse?
It's from an extract, so I'm not sure what the rest of it is.
It's verse 14.
Yeah, apparently.
And do you have a question about it?
I don't actually have a question.
Oh.
I just, I read it earlier this week, and I thought it might, resonated with me, and I thought it might help others. And also, if you had any specific thoughts on it, that'd be interesting, but if not, then that's good as well.
Okay, thank you, Luke. Thank you. So, Upadesa Saram, the text, Upadesa Saram, is a text that is 30 verses long. So it's a very short text, and it contains the entire teaching. It's condensed into 30 verses. And I've actually, on tomdas.com, which is my website, there's a version of it there, and I've put some brief commentary after each verse just to explain some aspects when it's needed. The Upadesa Saram, Upadesha means teaching or instruction. I think the literal meaning is instruction, but the ordinary meaning is spiritual teaching or spiritual instruction. And Saram means the essence. So Upadesha Saram means the essence of the teaching. In this case, it was given in 30 verses. Bhagavan wrote this himself. It's very concise. The first 15 verses, which is the first half, explain the 4 classical, traditional paths of yoga. Yeah. Jnana yoga, the path of knowledge. Bhakti yoga, the path of devotion. Raja yoga, which is basically the path of meditation. Karma yoga, the path of action. These 4 yogas. These 4 yogas traditionally lead to self-realization. Bhagavan has filled in some of the gaps and said, actually, these 4 yogas, they do lead to realization, but they go through a last step, which is self-inquiry. They lead to self-inquiry naturally, and then that leads to liberation. So these 4 yogas do lead to liberation. They all culminate in self-inquiry. Now, you may, if you follow one of these paths, eventually you will end up doing self-inquiry and realize what you are. You may not realize you've done self-inquiry because it's just an intuitive, natural unfolding. But that's what would have happened. That process of self-inquiry would have happened maybe without the seeker realizing that's what they were doing. The latter 15 verses, verse 16 to 30, then explain the teaching of self-inquiry. I don't think I actually made this clear in my commentary, actually. In my commentary, I tried to keep my commentary very minimal because I didn't want my commentary to intrude on the beauty of the actual teaching verses. In one sense, the entire teaching is given in the first 15 verses because the 4 yogas are fully discussed. Well, not fully discussed. They're it's relatively brief because it's only 15 verses. So in this verse, verse 14, and I can't remember the verse, I might sound like I'm quite a scholar on these things. I'm not really at all. I've just, it's just been a long time that I've been reading these things now. So I pick things up. I am not someone who's good at memorizing verses and remembering things at all. It's just that if you've been talking about this stuff for a while, some of it rubs off and you start to remember things. That's what it's more like for me. So please don't think, oh gosh, Tom knows all these words and verses. I don't. I just, some things I remember. So I can't remember verse 14 in its entirety. Does anyone actually have access to Upadesa Saram now? Would anyone be able to read verse 14? Anita, are you happy to do that? It sounds like, because usually in Upadesa Saram, most of the verses are roughly 4 lines long. I think you read about 2 of the lines, Luke, I think. But while Anita's checking, that verse sounds like it's teaching the path of Raja Yoga, which is an 8-fold path. And one of the main aspects of the path from a spiritual point of view is to regulate the breath in some way.
It's the full verse.
It is the full verse.
Yes.
Could you read it, please?
Yes. Breath controlled and thought restrained, the mind turned one way inward, fades and dies.
Mm. Can you read that again, please, Anita?
Breath controlled and thought restrained, the mind turned one way inward, fades and dies.
Beautiful. So here we have the 2 things that are stilled, the breath and the mind. When we go in towards the self, the breath and the mind are automatically controlled. Do you remember I said to Demetrius earlier, it doesn't matter how busy your mind is, right? This kind of contradicts this verse, the way you read it, Luke, doesn't it, in a way? Because the verse, the way you read it, which is the typical traditional Raja Yoga method, is let's still the mind by regulating the breath. And when the mind has reached a degree of peace and calm, we can then turn it inwards, investigate who am I, discover the self. It's a very beautiful method. It's a good method. The method Bhagavan says is we don't have to worry about the body-mind world. Let's just discover what we are. And when we do that, the mind and the breath are automatically regulated without having to worry about it. So it bypasses the first step in the verse, which is breath control. And in Raja Yoga, breath control is the means for mind control. And then a controlled mind can then investigate the self. This indirect path, because we go through breath control. Bhagavan says this breath control isn't necessary. You can do it, fine. That's no problem. If you want to do that, that's fine. And some people will want to do that. I really like that technique. But it's not for everyone. These 4 yogas, you can, most people, they'll gravitate more to one of these 4. And the yoga they gravitate towards will vary depending where they're at on the path. For some people, they'll just stick with one of those 4 yogas, and that's it for them. That's their path. But for many of us, most people will probably flip between these 4. They'll have a bit of devotion sometimes, a bit of meditation sometimes, so on and so on. So we integrate these 4 yogas, and then we end up doing self-inquiry. Anita, can you read the next verse, verse 15? It should be the culmination of, if I'm right, the first 15 verses give the traditional path. So first 15 should hopefully be give some kind of finality. I hope I'm right.
Mind extinct, the mighty seer returns to his own natural being and has no action to perform.
So then this is the second verse, or the next verse, about Raja Yoga, which is that the mind is extinct. The mind represents ignorance. Ignorance is the idea around the body-mind. That idea is the prime thought, the first thought upon which all other thoughts depend. So when that thought is removed, all the thoughts collapse, and then you're just with God, with Bhagavan. And verse 16, it probably should start the path of self-inquiry, I think. Is that right? Sorry, Anita, are you closing the book every time? And then it's like...
No, I'm switching off the microphone every time. But yeah, it's 16, right? It is true wisdom for the mind to turn away from outer objects and behold its own effulgent form.
Please read that one more time, Anita. That's a beautiful verse.
It is true wisdom for the mind to turn away from outer objects and behold its own effulgent form.
So this is now, he's not talking about the breath. He's not talking about the mind. He's not talking about controlling the breath. He's not talking about controlling the mind. He's not talking about any physical posture you've got to assume or any traditional method. He's just going straight now to self-inquiry. What is true wisdom? Wisdom is jnana. Jnana is traditionally translated as knowledge. What is knowledge? Normally, what is knowledge? Knowledge means knowledge of objects, knowledge of things. Bhagavan is telling us what true knowledge is, true wisdom. What is wisdom normally? Normally, we say someone is wise. They maybe know lots of stuff. Maybe they understand lots of things, objects, the world. They're very learned. They know about things. Bhagavan is saying this is not the true learning. The true learning is to turn away from objects. Be with that which you are, the effulgent being. This is the shortcut, the direct path that's open to everyone. But you can choose whichever one you want to choose. It's all good. At some points in our journey, we feel like we need these initial things so we can do self-inquiry. Later, we realize all those initial things were actually delay and distraction. Initial things like breath control or whatever it is, purifying the mind. Making the mind good. This is why Bhagavan doesn't spend that much time talking about purification unless the seeker starts to insist on it. But this is the way it goes. So if you feel you need it, then by all means do it. It'll probably be helpful to you. At least that's how it will appear. Thank you, Anita. Luke, was that okay as a few comments? Do you have you're welcome to respond if you want to.
It's very helpful, thanks. I guess the only response I had is, to what degree is it practical saying that you can just realize yourself? Because I think I agree, but for people living in busy lives, and we talked about this last time as well, well, not last time, the time before last, turning around the oil tanker, like, to what degree is it practical saying you can just realize yourself or just switch the oil tanker at full speed? And therefore, like, is suggesting stuff like breath control and yoga actually not a necessary step, but a very much encouraged step?
I mean, ultimately, you see, nothing in Maya is practical. Nothing in Maya is practical. The only practical teaching is self-inquiry, because that takes you straight out of Maya. Everything else is delaying coming out of Maya. You know, even slowing the tanker around and coming around gently is a delay. But yes, it's also eminently practical, which is why I say those sorts of things, because the teaching is given not through any sort of it's the teaching is spontaneously given, and it's not the, I can't, what's the opposite of spontaneously? It's not sort of I'm not deliberately thinking it out. The teaching is spontaneously given in a way that is a natural response to the seeker, the questioner. So the answer is a reflection of the question. So if in the question, if the questioner, the seeker, has certain difficulties, then the answer is a response to that, you see? So the teaching is dynamic. Another way of saying it is the teaching is bespoke. I hope I'm using that word in the right way. My understanding of the word bespoke is that it's tailored. It's tailored to the unique question. Every question is unique. It's not just the words, which, you know, most of the questions you've asked, I've heard them many times before in the words. But for me, every time I hear that question, it's like I've never heard that question before. I don't answer it from memory. There's obviously utilization of memory in the answer, but the answer isn't coming from memory. So it's not a rehearsed answer. The answer is tailor-made to the question. What it comes down to is, if you are finding these practices helpful, then I encourage them. I encourage you to do that. But if you say, do I need to do them? And you're actually asking me, I'll say no. But then if you're saying, should I do them? Well, then I say, well, you know, it's up to you. I'm not here to tell you what to do. I don't want to tell anyone what to do. I really mean that. I'm not interested in that. If you say, you know, I really find this practice helpful, it helps me in this way, that way, you know, what do you think? I'll say, that's great. Carry on. Or, you know, but remember at some point to discover what you are. As soon as you're able to. As soon as you're able to, turn within. There's a there's another attendee here who's not here today. I'm sure he won't mind me saying, Massimo spent some time asking me about breath, and he sent me I'm sure he won't mind me mentioning, he sent me a whole series of emails he asked me about this in Satsang, and then Massimo's not here, so is he? No, he's not. And then he sent me some emails, and in response, I wrote a post on. I just thought, well, by the time I've written all these answers, you know, Massimo has, you know, if you, for those of you who know him, you'll know this already. He's just such a lovely person, such a open-hearted, amazing person. So when he emailed me all these questions, he's got so much love for me, I feel, and I have so much love for him. When all these questions came in my inbox, I just felt moved to sort of go into, you know, to answer them all, because I'm not always moved to answer all these questions. And I ended up just writing this blog post. I think there are a couple of blog posts on the breath and self-inquiry that resulted from that interaction. You can, and I couldn't tell you what they're called, but probably if you do a search for Tom Das and breath and self-inquiry, you'll see some posts on it. And I think in at least one of them, I quoted Sadhana Saram, which is this text written by Sri Sadhuvan, which also talks about this, the role of these sorts of other practices. Essentially, the shortcut to save you from reading the blog post, my recollection is, do them. And then as soon as you're able to stop doing them and do self-inquiry, do that. I think that's the gist of it, from what I recall. That's certainly what I'd say now. If you find anything helpful, anything, then I encourage that. Doesn't matter what that is, you know. If you say ballroom, you find ballroom dancing particularly helpful, what are my views on ballroom dancing? And I'll say, well, if you're finding it helpful, then do the ballroom dancing. And I mean that. I really mean that. Ballroom dancing can be a spiritual practice. You know, if you say to me, oh, Tom, I heard you said ballroom dancing is okay, but when I tried it, I didn't really like it very much. You know, I prefer the rumba. I'll say, okay, I recommend you switch to the rumba. You know. And so on and so on. So I have my biases as well, because if you start mentioning a practice which I particularly liked, then you might evoke a bit of response on that level as well from Tom. You know, if you start saying how you fall in love with Bhagavan and you have a photo of him, you know, in your bedroom or something, and every time you gaze at his photo, you fall in love with him, you know, then you'll start to get Tom going about, oh yeah, that's brilliant, excellent, wonderful, you know, because I think that's the best way. But that's only because that's what happened to me. You know, I've just thought maybe it's a bit like men and their hobbies. You know, I don't know what it's. Maybe it's the same for women as well. Maybe it's incredibly sexist what I'm about to say. But men and their hobbies. If you find another guy who's into the same thing as you, suddenly you get this sort of burst of energy, and you think, oh yeah, and da, 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 you know. Doesn't mean that hobby is better or worse, sorry. Just means you struck a mutual interest. The other thing I love so much about Bhagavan's teachings, that his teachings are so rare. They're such a rare beacon of clarity. And it doesn't, I mean, theoretically, it doesn't have to be like that. It could be they're like 100 or thousands of teachers who have incredibly clear teachings, in which case, you know, you could go to any one of those. But it just so happens, in my experience at least, my experience of teachings, and I haven't experienced them all, right? that Bhagavan Ramana's teachings are just a beacon of clarity that stand out above other teachings as far as I can see in terms of their clarity. And ability and effectiveness to liberate. There's the other reason why I'm so enthusiastic about people coming to Bhagavan. Because there just aren't other sorts of teachers and teachings around like him. Theoretically, there could be, in which case I'll be happy for you to go to any of those. But from what I've witnessed, there aren't that many. So if you're coming to Bhagavan's teachings, then, you know, I feel you're safe. You're safe anyway. But I feel you're approaching your destination. Again, obviously it's a metaphor. We're already there, but in terms of exiting Maya, you're approaching the destination. You're coming home. It's like when you're sailing on an ocean. You're sailing in the ocean and all you see all around you is the horizon. There's no land to be seen. And then you get a sign of civilization. That's like when you come to Bhagavan's teaching, it's like that first sign of land. Maybe the white dove flying towards you, maybe a lighthouse you see in the distance. Maybe you see smoke rising from chimneys in the horizon. This is like, oh, I found Bhagavan's teaching. Oh, it's like that. Yes, you're coming home. And I'm sure there are many other ways as well, but I know this way. It's all the same way.